Welcome. I'm Frank Harris, and I have the privilege of serving as the president of the Friends. I want to welcome you all here. What a great crowd we have on another beautiful day at North Oaks. We always seem to get wonderful weather for this event. Thank you for coming. We're all here because we like great books, great literature, and most of all, we like to hang out with great authors. And I assure you that we have one here today. I personally cannot wait to hear from our guest. Thank you. At this time, I'd like to introduce Judy Anderson. Judy is going to introduce our guest speaker today. She is a member of the Friends Program Committee, which she has formally chaired. She does yeoman's work for us. Judy, take over.
Thank you, Frank. I'm so pleased to see so many of you here on this lovely day. And it just feels good to be in a room full of readers. Others who enjoy the power and the pleasure of the written word, whether that be in print or braille or graphic, audio, electronic, or any other format. This actually happens to be the 37th consecutive year of this author luncheon. I am wondering if there are such a rich tradition that we have inherited here. I spoke with Meta Fridley, who is the president of the Friends Group, the original Friends Group, back in 1979. Recently, she regrets she couldn't be here with us today. But she told me about the work that they did in founding this organization. And she told me about the many albums that they put together to document their work. So I brought the one from 1979. It contains activities and people who were instrumental in creating that first Friends Group. I'll put it out in the lobby so that you can take a look at it later if you'd like to. When I went through the album, I discovered that the original author from that year is a man by the name of John J. Kobles. He wrote many books about Minnesota, its places, and its people. Among them, this one, F. Scott Fitzgerald in Minnesota, His Homes and His Haunts. This little book is still in circulation. 1978, it was published. So our authors have staying power, and that's great. We have enjoyed an outstanding succession of authors at this luncheon, and I know we're in for a treat today with our 2016 author Jonathan Odell, who has 3 novels to his credit, as well as short stories, news articles, essays. His book, The Healing, set on a plantation in the years preceding the Civil War, was nominated for a Minnesota Book Award in 2013. The book received a starred review in the Library Journal, and they said of it, engrossing. This historical novel probes complex issues of freedom and slavery. I just finished rereading it, and it moved me more the second time, I think, than the first. It's an extraordinary novel. Odell believes in the power of storytelling, and he writes about the Deep South and its citizens with an incredibly authentic voice, having been born and raised in Mississippi. He's a highly regarded public speaker and a leadership coach who now resides in Minnesota to our great benefit. Through his activism in civil rights causes, he seeks to bring racial reconciliation to today's society. He recently reworked a previous title, The View from Delphi, and republished it in this new edition entitled Miss Hazel and the Rosa Parks League. One reviewer said, with its deftly drawn characters, delicious dialogue, and deeply satisfying and hopeful ending, this fine novel deserves to win the hearts of readers everywhere. The late, great author Pat Conroy said of Odell's writing, Jonathan Odell can take his place in the distinguished pantheon of Southern authors. High praise indeed. I had the privilege of meeting Jonathan Odell 2.5 years ago at an event in Matamidi. There they have a reading initiative each fall called One Book, One Community, motto Read I. So, and that's been going on for 13 years, I believe. It was a typical Minnesota autumn evening, cold and dark and damp. Some people remember it even as stormy. It may have been. When a man in a large plaster cast made his way from the parking lot and came through the doors of the Chautauqua Fine Arts Center on crutches. It seems that Jonathan had taken a misstep 2 nights before and broken his foot. And yet here he was, made his way down through the large auditorium and up onto the stage and got his leg propped up so that he could engage us with stories from his formative years in Mississippi on through the present. All of this while he's fighting pain, fatigue, and facing surgery the next morning, as I recall. Needless to say, he won the hearts of all of us that evening for his courage and his determination and, well, frankly, for showing up. We were very grateful. So we are so happy there were no emergencies this time. Won't you please join me in welcoming this intrepid author, Jonathan Odell.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Thank you so much. Friends of Ramsey County Libraries, thank you. It's an honor to do this because I know you're picky about who you choose to talk to you. In fact, I won't be talking to you today. I found out that there is someone who read The Healing 4 times. She'll be talking to you. Come on up. I haven't read it 4 times. You have probably attended as many of these as I have because you're book lovers, and book lovers often want to know things that your casual group of attendees to a bookstore signing don't even think to ask. So what I'd like to know before I start is that what kind of questions do you have of me that you hope that I will get to as I talk to you, to make sure that I don't skip over them till it's too late. What kind of questions did you come with?
Why that is and how you do it so well.
Okay, great, good question. I like to talk about that. Anything else? A little bit about me. No, that's a lie. This will be a lot about me. In fact, it's about all I know how to talk about. Is that I didn't start writing until I was 45 years old. Before that, I was a businessman. I had a consulting company. I worked with Fortune 500 companies like 3M and Prudential and General Mills, and I worked with the executives. And the things that I did mostly was strategic planning. I also did leadership training, leadership coaching, which was more or less leadership therapy. Oftentimes, people who get to high positions, they're very, very lonely because they can't trust anybody else with their own thoughts. So I got to be a sounding board for these folks. Also, I did a lot of what we call conflict management, working out the anger in organizations and among teams. And I got to the point when I was 45 where either I was going to kill them or they were going to kill me. I was just dying. We were talking about midlife changes. I've had several changes. This was huge. I had mainly because I got to the top of a ladder. Have you ever read Joseph Campbell or know who he is, the mythologist? One of his favorite sayings was that true sadness is getting to the top of the ladder of success and realizing it was propped against the wrong wall. And I had done everything that I thought I was supposed to do. I was 45 years old. I had created a life that my father would have been proud of. I was a kind of a corporate hero. I had started my own business. I was making a lot of money. I had the perfect house in Golden Valley in the gay ghetto. I had the perfect yard. I had the perfect the car that everybody was supposed to have that year was the Land Rover. I had that. The dog everybody was supposed to have was a Springer Spaniel. I had that. My partner was gorgeous. I didn't realize until looking back that he looked exactly like my mother. So So it really wasn't my ladder I was climbing after all. And I had these clients that my client list was very impressive. And yet I wanted to die. I just got to the point. I'd come here in 1980. I'm probably the only person who's ever moved to Minnesota not to get sober. So it wasn't until 2 years later, as I was Vice President of Human Resources, that somebody said, you know, you really ought to take a look at your drinking. And luckily, I found I lived in the land of 10,000 treatment centers, and my company paid for it. So about 1981, I got into treatment and got into therapy and started working on some of the family issues. When you talk to people who have an addiction, or friends who have an addiction, or if you have an addiction, what you know is quitting the substance is the easy part, but dealing with the brokenness that makes you want to use the substance, that's the hard part. For me, it was a dysfunctional family. It was being gay in a very straight world that I had chosen. And I worked on this, thought I had really come to the point where I got it all now, and it was all falling apart. So I went back to this therapist that I met back in 1982, and I said, I don't get it. I've got everything that's on my to-do list. I got the big house, I got the big car, I got the so-and-so and so-and-so and so-and-so. And he says, oh, well, that's because you hate what you do. And I said, what has that got to do with anything? In fact, my father, who was a successful businessman in Mississippi, gave me one word of advice about work. He says, Johnny, when you find a job you only hate 95% of, you got a damn good job. And that's true for him because he was a Depression-era kid. And so about raising your family, I mean, you really need, it wasn't about enjoying your work and quality of work life. It was about surviving. But here I was, going by this old rule that had nothing to do with me. I mean, I was a gay man. I didn't have kids to put through college. I didn't have to have, it was like, why am I, and I say, well, what do I do? I'm too far into it to quit because I'm really good at what I do. He says, but you're not happy at what you do. And I'd never really thought about that those two things go together. In fact, now when I tell high school seniors, I get to talk to a lot of high school seniors now, they're reading the book. I said, you know, teachers close your eyes, parents shut your ears, but I need to tell these kids something. That is, never get good at what you hate. Never get good at what you hate. Because if you get good at what you hate, guess what? You get to do more of it. And you get really, really good, people pay you more for it. And you get in the middle of life and you realize, boy, some 17, 18-year-old idiot chose my career for me, and I'm stuck with it. So I said, what do I do? And he said, quit, which is something else my father never told me a man got to do. Because a man doesn't quit. You keep going and going and going until you die in your traces, until you fall over dead. There's honor in never quitting. So he said, you need to quit. And I said, well, what do I do instead? He says, I have no idea what you should do instead. He said, my guess is when you were a kid, your fondest dream wasn't to grow up to be a businessman like your dad. I think you had another dream. And I said, what was it? And he said, well, I'm your therapist, not your psychic. I don't have no idea what it was. He says, but here's how you start. And he says, you're not going to like this because it goes against your grain, everything that you have done. He said, you need to go into your life and say no to everything that hurts. Say no to it. He says, I wouldn't worrying about what you love because there's no room for any love in your life because it's all filled with obligations. There's no space. Joy has to have space to get into your soul. And you got it so crammed full of things that you have to do and that you ought to do that you wouldn't recognize joy if it bit you. So I was serious because I really wanted to die. I did not know what to do. Every rule that I was living my life by had fallen apart and was giving me nothing. So I went home and I broke up with my partner, which wasn't a big deal because we didn't love each other anyway. I mean, the biggest thing we told each other was, well, who else would have you? You know, make that look nice on a Valentine's Day card, you know? It's like, so we broke up, and then I sold the house because it was all obligation. The house was never big enough. The yard was never big enough. I kept the car because I needed to move all my stuff out of the house. I got rid of my business. I gave away all my clients. And I moved into a 2-room apartment. And then it just hit me. I had been lied to all of my life. This felt good. I woke up in the morning for the first time since I was 5, excited to get up, but going, wow, I don't have to do for anybody today. I just get to say, what do I want to do? There was this joy about it, this energy that I hadn't felt since I was a kid. I felt like I was an adolescent, or the adventure was out there. So I went back to the therapist and I said, whatever you did, it's good. I said, tell me now, what do I do? I said, I still don't know what I do. And he said, why don't you travel? That'd be a good thing to do. You can afford it. And that's the way to kind of shake the cobwebs off and put things in a new context. People often travel. I said, great, I'll go to London or Edinburgh or Dublin, trace back my ancestors. I'll take a friend with me. I said, I can afford that too. He said, no, you don't understand. Go to a place you don't speak the language. Go by yourself. Do not go on a tour, and don't read a tour book. He said, you have been organizing and planning your life till you planned all the delight out of it. He said, you cannot be delighted until you are surprised, and you have not allowed yourself to get surprised. And to get surprised, you have to first get lost. You don't get surprised unless you don't know where you're going. So I went to Costa Rica for 3 months. I didn't speak any Spanish. And we'd I'd go to the middle of the cafe in whatever town that I was in the middle of the town, and find somebody there speaking Spanish that I wanted to talk to, and I'd somehow kind of work out that I was a tourist, which wasn't hard to tell. And then when I was trying to donde, what I want to know is, where do I go now? What do I do? I said, of course. He said, they'd say, why don't you go here and here and here and here? And so that day I'd pack up and I'd go there. And I got lost for 3 months. And I met the most amazing people when I didn't have to control them, when I didn't have to plan for them, and just let them come into my life and let things happen. And I had to do something that I was also told a man shouldn't do, and that was ask for help. You know how men don't even like to ask for directions. And it's a sin to ask for directions. It's a sin to say that I can't do something, I can't figure something else. But I was so lost, I just had to ask for help. You know what? It felt wonderful. It felt like, oh, I'm in this world with other people. We're in this together. So at the end of the summer, I had a memory, which was, if you ever have old memories, and sometimes you can see them like movies, but they're detached from any kind of feeling. It's just like an old photo. There's nothing. Well, I had this old memory that I'd had for a long time, but I'd never had a feeling about it until this morning. I woke up in the Osa Peninsula in a rainforest, and there were these in a tree house, and there were these howler monkeys going off, and I was dreaming this old dream, which was I was driving out in the country with my father in Sandersville, Mississippi, which is very, very rural, and we would always, on a trip to church, he would always stop with me at the railroad tracks. He'd always stop, no matter if there was anything around or not. No trains, no sound, nothing. But he would full stop, and then he would go ahead. And my father was always in charge and always control of everything. So I knew that whatever he was doing was important. So finally I said, Daddy, why do you stop? And he pointed this big rectangle sign, and he says, because it tells you to. I said, what tells you to? Because I was only 5, I couldn't read. He says, Mississippi law, stop. And those were the first 3 words that I ever learned to read. And I said, God has to live there, because nobody tells my daddy what to do. And plus, if they did, he wouldn't do it. So I want to learn the magic of God in those block letters. And I fell in love with words. I fell in love with language. And I woke up and said, you know what I really wanted to do, but too ashamed to tell anybody, I wanted to write a book about Mississippi. Ever since I was a little kid, I thought about, I need to tell the real story about home. And I never had written before. I'd never done a short story. I've never tried fiction. I'd read all just academic books or business books, because, you know, only nonfiction is true. Little did I know. And so I decided I want to go back and write a novel. I took a few classes, and first I was really, really, really bad. And then I was not so bad. And then about the 10th draft, I was a little better. And then eventually it got published. And in 2004, this book came out. It was called The View from Delphi. It's a 500-page doorstopper. It's a big book. And small press, but a press I really wanted called McAdam Cage. They publish a lot of Southern writers, and they were very choosy about who they picked. They never thought they'd be a big company. They didn't want to. They knew who they were. They were a mid-sized press, and they for more literary readers, high literary fiction. So they chose the book, and then the year after they chose me, actually that same year, they made a mistake and signed a book called The Time Traveler's Wife, which blew them out of the water. Most of the organizations that I worked with, they didn't have problems because of a quick decrease in sales. Their biggest problems was an unexpected increase in sales. Tonka Toys, remember them? They were just like a mid-sized company. They had a great loyal following. They were predictable. And then they came out with two toys in a 2-year period. One was Pound Puppies and the other was GoBots. And they were an international phenomenon. It blew the company out of the water. They couldn't handle the success and eventually they went under and had to be bought by Parker Brothers. The same way with McAdam Cage. So they didn't put a lot of money into the marketing. Luckily, Carrie Miller had just come to Minneapolis to take over from Catherine Lanford on the Talking Volumes, and she chose this as her debut book. So it became a bestseller in that 3-state area. That's how powerful she was. And also became a bestseller in Mississippi because my mother made everybody read it. And it sold enough to go into paperback, and then it went under. But luckily, right when it was going under, the company, I got the rights back, which isn't supposed to happen. I got the rights back to my first book, rather than being sold off to debtors. And then Marley Rusoff read my manuscript to The Healing, which is this book. Now, Marley Rusoff, you go to our webpage, says we don't send anything, we're happy with who we've got. She has Pat Conroy, Margaret Atwood, those kind of people. And so I said, no, I'm going to cheat, because I learned that in organizations. People who get ahead in organizations are not the one who's paid by the rules. They're the ones who get shafted. The ones who get ahead are the ones who, not necessarily unethically cheat, but break the rules, bend the rules. They say the rules don't apply to me and my idea. So I just sent it to her. She read half of it, called me up. I was with my mom at the time, and she says, I want this book. I just love this book. So, and then she sold it to Random House, which is a dream. Here I was, 45 years old, never written before, and not only Random House, Nan Talese, her imprint, which is Gay Talese, Nan Talese. I mean, this is like premier, and they took the book. The book did really, really well. And that book is about a midwife on a slave plantation in the 1850s. I just fell in love with the power of these women that I grew up with, these midwives in Mississippi, these black midwives who were very powerful women, spiritual women, and I got interested in their past, not so much their medical expertise, but how they use medicine to subvert white power on the plantations, how they use the healing metaphor to bring communities together, and did that all the way through Jim Crow. So I decided to write that book. Then Marley, because the healing was successful, said, I've never read Delphi. I ought to read that. And I said, yeah, because I've got the rights. We can do something with it. She read it. She read it in one weekend. And she called up and she says, I am so pissed. And I said, why? She says, this is so much better than The Help. I went, oh, well, tell me more. Tell me more. She said, it's just not fair. She says, this is a woman's book. And it was marketed, look at the book. It looks like William Faulkner set a forest fire. It looks like, it's like blood and guts and incest and she said, this is a gentle book, and plus it's about women. And that's where we are today. It's like not only are we refighting all the racial stuff in this post-racial society, so that's more powerful when the book came out, the conversation around race, but she says, this is a feminist book. She said, that's what I'm amazed about, because this tells the story of women that hasn't been told in the 1950s Mississippi, because she knew, like I did, but no, the history books don't know, is that it was the black women who spearheaded the civil rights movement in Mississippi. They're the ones who, it wasn't the black men, it wasn't the preachers, it wasn't the school teachers, it was these sharecroppers, these illiterate women who had nothing else to lose except their lives, but wanted something for their kids. that they could never have. And they stood in those courthouse doors. Their houses were burned down. They're the ones who dragged their kids to segregated schools. They could do it because something that women in a society can do. They're invisible. And in the South, it's the white man, it's the white woman, then below that's the black man, and then totally invisible is the black woman. They're just not seen. They're seen as furniture in the houses, as maids. So white men talk over them and plan their atrocities, thinking that, oh, loyal Bessie's not going to tell anybody. And what happened was there was a KGB in Mississippi made up of black women. And they were the ones shaming these black preachers into opening their churches up to the civil rights movement. It was the black women who were taking in the civil rights workers from up north and bedding them in their houses in spite of what the Klan was doing. So she said, we need to re-release this book. And she said, there needs to be some changes. Because the original book was 500 pages, and it's about two women, a black woman and a white woman. And I'm very linear. I'm my oldest kid, first child, so everything has to make sense to me. A, B, C, do things in order. And so I wrote the book in order. I knew it was about two women, and I knew that Vida and Hazel, the Vida is the black woman, Hazel is the white woman. I knew the reader needed to know about their background before they met, so you'd understand the significance of these two women meeting. Well, so I wrote a backstory. I started with Hazel and wrote her backstory, and then Vida, and it was like by page 250 they finally meet. And if you picked up the book reading about two women in the South, it's like you've got to be really patient to wait through 250 pages before they say howdy. And she says they need to meet earlier. I went, oh God, I can't cut all that stuff out because I didn't see how to do that. And my husband, has been on stage, says no. He said, what we learn in theater is that two characters don't have to physically meet on the page to meet in the reader's mind. So they can be passing on the same territory, looking at each other, not knowing each other, but making judgments about each other. And that was a miracle. That was like one of those blinding glimmers of the obvious, a BGO. It's like, oh yeah, of course. So I rewrote the book, and writing it that way dropped 100 pages out of it. Because I didn't need to tell every intricate detail. I could do a little bit in backstory. I could tell the reader what they needed it, when they needed it. Rather than saying, okay, now what I'm going to do is give you a 200-page lecture before you can really enjoy the book. Is that, I learned that the way that I write, my first book, and the hardest thing was, I made a lot of money as a consultant, and the way that you make money as a consultant is to make sure there's no tension, to make sure you can explain, talk away, set up, preface, contextualize the situation to melt the tension away. That's fatal as a writer, because readers read for tension. So I felt like, to be an honest writer, I had to put everything in there and lead you by the nose. You read writers who will do that. It was like you know exactly where they're taking you. You know the road they're going to take, and it's like there's no fun in it. There's no surprise in it. So I learned to take out a lot of stuff and just put it in when the reader was asking for it. So I wonder why, and then you put it in. So that restructuring it and then retitling, The View from Delphi, a lot of bookstores put it in their travel section. It's a horrible name. People couldn't remember it going to the bookstore. It's like something about Greece. Something about Greece. And then, so she said, why don't you rename it something that really gets at who it is? Go for your target audience. And my target audience is really clear. It's women and men who aren't afraid of their feelings. And my hero is Pat Conroy. Whatever you think about him literarily, he goes for the gut. He goes for the emotions. One of my greatest experiences, I got to share the stage with him last September before he died. Just him and me up there telling stories. And he said, when he wrote this blurb for my book, I called my mother up. And I said, Mama, I said, here's what Pat Conroy said about your son. And I read it, she started crying. So I told Pat Conroy, I said, you made my mother cry. He says, good, I love to make women cry. And I do too. It's like, It goes against a lot of the grain of a lot of modern literature, which is supposed to be more intellectual and more minimalist and et cetera. I like full-blown feelings. And sometimes I hit it and sometimes I miss it, just like Pat Conroy. So she wanted to emphasize that's the kind of book that it was, and also it took place in a historical perspective. That's why we put Rosa Parks on the front of the cover, even though she doesn't show up in the book. Her example inspires a bunch of maids in Mississippi, which is how it really happened, about women saying, wow, not Martin Luther King, but here's a woman who did it. Here's a woman who can't take anymore. Here's a woman who said no. That's the kind of story that they needed to take over, just to see themselves. In fact, I have a friend, Don Samuels, who's the mayor of, who ran for mayor. He was a city councilman of Minneapolis, African-American, does a lot of civil rights work. And when I was telling him I was writing this book years ago, he says, about Mississippi, and I said, yeah, so it says it's about race, and I said, well, yeah, if it's about Mississippi, it's about race. And he says, great, exactly what we need, another book about race by a white man. And he says, but do me a favor. He said, if you write a book about race in Mississippi with black characters, do not write another To Kill a Mockingbird. I went, oh my God, that's like stabbing me through the heart. That was a formative book for me. And it's along with a lot of other kids in the 1960s in the North who read that book and realized it was like a shock. This is going on in my country. And they signed up and they went down south to work in the civil rights movement. See, it was a seminal book. And I said, all my white friends who love this, all the white liberals that I know, he said, exactly, it's a book for white liberals. It's not a book for black people. Why don't you write a book? He said, look at my two kids. It was Asante and Amani. One was like 3 and one was like 5 at the time. He says, I will never let them read that book. And I said, why? He says, I don't want them reading one more book that tells them that as a black woman, they need a white man to save them. Because look how dark they are. And they're dark kids. He said, ain't no white man going to save them. If they're going to get saved, they're going to have to save themselves. And why don't you give us a hero, a black woman, because there are sure a lot of them that you can get written down. Because they're the ones that's where the character of Ida came from, was to make sure that if a black girl reads this, there was a character in there that she didn't have to feel ashamed of, that was redemptive, that was powerful, that was gutsy, that was three-dimensional. So, have no idea what led me to talk about that. I just hope it was interesting. Let me tell you a little bit about starting to write and what happened. Is that I took a couple of writing courses but dropped out of them because I was too embarrassed. In fact, you know, before I started to play golf, I read 6 books about playing golf before I ever showed up on the... So I figured writing was the same way. Learn everything you can before you risk making a fool out of yourself. And so I took these courses and I just realized how competitive writing was. People who couldn't write knew how to talk writing. So if they were using words I'd never heard of, like tension and like omniscient point of view, and third person, and arc. It's like, I don't know that kind of stuff. And I got embarrassed and I quit. Then it hit me. As a 45-year-old man, I don't have time to go back to the beginning again and learn from scratch. I got to take what I got. I got to take whatever it is I got. Right now I got my enthusiasm. And I'm from Mississippi and I got stories. And then I learned something really important about writing, which puts to rest this horrible, horrible rule that writing teachers always tell you, which I think does more harm than good, and that is, you can probably finish the sentence for me. Write what you know. That's horrible advice. Don't write what you know. What you know is boring. And especially for us middle-aged people, what you know is what got you in the mess that you're in today. It's like repeating the stuff that we're so sure about and that we preach about and that we have rules about. That strangles the brain. So what I did instead, I said, I don't know how to write and I don't know anything. I don't even like thinking about what I know because I don't want to think about, I don't want to write a book on business. I don't want to write a book on therapy. I don't want to write, so I said, instead, I'm going to write what I'm drawn to know. I said, I'm halfway through with life, supposedly. And there are a couple of questions I want to have the answers to before I die. That's what I want to write about. So what I tell kids now, don't worry about what you know. Worry about what you're drawn to know. What do you want to know? Because it takes 5 years to write a good historical novel. What's going to keep you awake for 5 years? It's certainly not preaching. It's certainly not telling things you already know. It's about discovery. And I promise you, if you read my book or any author's book and you're going through it, all of a sudden you're surprised and delighted, I promise you, the author was surprised and delighted at the same time. Because they were drawn into the mystery of writing. They were in an area they didn't know how it was going to turn out. Because it's not linear. It's one of those things you go, oh, I never saw that coming, but gosh, it makes sense. Those things you can't plan. Those things come by letting go of what you know and letting the world flush in. So I decided there were 2 things that I wanted to know before I died. One was, what made my family as crazy as they were? Especially my mother, who is the cornerstone of crazy. So how did she get to be? And I dragged her into therapy. I dragged my father into therapy. They made that trip up the Mississippi River several times to my therapist's office. I yelled at them. I screamed at them. I told them how dysfunctional we were. I laid it out. Textbook. Here's what you did. Here's how screwed up you were. And this is how it screwed me up. Get it? Thank you for asking us to come. You will come anytime. Can't you be nicer next time? So I went through and went through my anger phase, which was necessary in finding your own feet in the world and doing what psychologists call self-differentiation. But I didn't know my parents any better. I didn't know who they were. And so when I worked my first draft of this book, which was actually a hit piece, I figured, well, I'm going to get even my parents. I want to write everything they did to me in this book. So that finally, because I still believe in that railroad sign, the power of the written word, if you can explain it good enough, then my parents will have a transformational experience and they will say, Johnny, we're so sorry what we did for you. How can we make it up to you? We were all wrong. So I decided I would do that. So I wrote that the first draft of the book was everything about my parents that I hated. I mean, it was everything. And I didn't have to imagine much. I just put it all in there. You know, the part that I left in about Hazel getting in the car in the Lincoln drunk and driving and turning over her car on New Year's Eve in the sheriff's yard, that's fictional. She got drunk, got into the Lincoln, turned it on Christmas Eve and turned the car over in the mayor's yard. So, of a town of 5,000 people, that makes you really popular the next day in school, by the way. So I put that in the book, plus some other things that I eventually took out, but it was clear who it was. In fact, I even killed the boy's dog in the first draft. I had him molested. I had everything in there, and I named the kid Johnny, just to make sure that my mother didn't miss the point. And I even I took the book, the manuscript home, this horrible hit piece, this morality play with Johnny was the victim. You know, I did everything I could to punish this kid. That's how I thought you made people read a book, was to punish their characters and you feel sorry for them and keep reading. And so I gave it to my dad to read first, and he read it and then said, no, you can't let your mother read this. I said, why not? She'll be back in the Lincoln again, drunk. You know what that's like. And I said, no. I said, what if Oprah chooses it for her book club? I just owe it to her to tell her directly rather than her finding out about it on TV. It's like, God, it's so arrogant. I just wanted to she needs to read it. So I gave her the manuscript and then immediately regretted it because I can come home an older, wiser, college-educated, master's degree in counseling psychology with an emphasis in alcohol and drug abuse, by the way, which I must have gotten in a blackout sometime. I don't remember. But I had all of this. I was a smart adult, so I went home and 10 minutes around my mother, and I'm a 6-year-old child again. It's just there. I mean, so she died last year, and I'm still that way. I mean, my job growing up, my father made it clear that my mother was a fragile being, and we needed to be really careful. And Johnny, you're the oldest one. Your job is to make sure that your mother never suffers. He never put it that way, but I knew it. Whenever she was upset or went on a binge or whatever, it was my fault. So here I was. I gave her the tool of her own destruction. 130 pages of dreck aimed at her. So I wanted to grab it back, and oh God, but she kept reading it. One page after the next page, it just No emotions on her face, nothing, blank, until the very end. She puts the last page and she starts crying. Because I'm more devastated probably than she is. And so thank God I had this master's degree in counseling psychology. I said, well, Mom, it looks like you're having feelings. So she said, yeah. She said, the book is so sad. And I said, well, yeah. I said, what was sad about it for you? And she said, just one thing. I said, what, Mama? She says, I only wish I could have been that little boy's mother. It's the beauty of being a narcissist. And it's like, that's what I learned. That's how she survived her horrible, horrible life. So she didn't know the difference until it was a couple of years later when the book was finally published. And I was on TV on Mississippi Public Radio TV. And the guy who was interviewing me asked me, he says, this book is a lot, you use a lot of your Southern experiences. And I said, yeah, it's a lot about my mom. He said, oh, really? He says, how did she react to that? And I told him that story I just told you. Forgetting that she is in Laurel, Mississippi, watching TV because this program is live. Immediately I get off the sound stage and she's calling and she says, that book was about me? Said the kid's name was Johnny. God. And I said, but luckily I'd gone through my anger period and it's more into reconciliation and had a more appreciation because I'd rewritten the book with my parents' help. Because I didn't know the South. I grew up in the South trying to get out of it because I was a gay kid. And I was looking over my shoulder all the time. I didn't have time to look at the trees, the flowers, or the weather. In fact, my first writing teacher read this and she says, don't people in Mississippi sweat? She said, don't they have bodies? I was real disappointed that when you're writing a book, people had to have bodies. And Dr. Trees, and she said, if you're writing Southern fiction, the thing about Southern fiction is setting. Setting is a character, and I knew nothing about it. So I called up my parents when I decided to rewrite the book, and I said, Mom and Dad, I got a deal for you. I need your help, but let's don't talk about my childhood anymore, because I don't think we're ever going to come to an agreement on that. I said, we grew up in different families together to some extent, because my story is totally different from your story, and that's just the way that it works. I guess it's enough that we know each other's story. And I said, but, Mama, I need to know how to make cat's head biscuits. And Daddy, I need to know what it's like to be in a cotton field at 5 o'clock in the morning at sunrise before you have to go to school. I needed their stories. And through telling me their stories, they introduced me to themselves. It wasn't about, if you sit down with somebody and you say, well, tell me what it was like during World War II, they go to their left brain. They tell you all the facts. Well, Roosevelt was president, and of course we had a bow. And sort of. But if you say, what did you have for breakfast during the 40s or during the 30s? What was the breakfast? What was the kitchen like? They pull, or how did something feel? How did a cotton plant feel when you're pulled it? If you go to the tactile memories, the sensory memories, the olfactories, that's where the real memories are buried. Not in the left brain, but in the right brain. So over the next year, they just told me all their stories, and they became Hazel and Floyd in a more redemptive way than the first draft. The second thing that I really wanted to know was how did we, as a white culture in Mississippi, make half the people there disappear? It wasn't just that we're brutal to them. It wasn't just that we had Jim Crow. We as children were taught not to even see them. And the northern people have a hard time understanding segregation in the South, the whole Jim Crow thing. You think about, oh, there were legal laws. It was called segregation de jure, which is by law, and institutions were legally segregated. And schools and churches and et cetera. And the movie theaters that I went to, the Arabian Theater, I sat on the bottom floor and all the black kids sat on the top floor and knew they were up there, but they were out of mind. There were just some of the, until they poured ice on us. They would often do that to wake us up. But other than that, Jim Crow kept them in the background, invisible. And I often wondered about how we did that. That's what I wanted to write about. How do you take a 5-year-old, 6-year-old kid they're all innocent, I went to church every Sunday and sang that song, They Are Precious in His Sight, yellow, black, brown, and white, and believed in this compassionate, loving Christ. And then we'll go out on the streets, and the worst things in the world would happen, and I didn't see them. And I learned in psychology later, by the age of 5 or 6, mostly we see what we believe instead of believing what we see. Does that make sense? We see what we're taught is truth, rather than looking at something and deciding truth. And I was taught that my parents were good Christian people and that white folks cared about those black people. And so I was blind to it. I didn't see it. And if you read one of the stories in Delphi or in Miss Hazel, it was the day that I learned that. It was a 6-year-old kid sitting in the backyard, 5-year-old kid, and a man next door was raking, a black man. He's raking the straw, and at that time I wasn't racist yet. And you don't sit down and make somebody racist. You absorb it. And you don't absorb it from the people you hate, like the George Wallaces or the Klan. You absorb it from people you love, who try to make you feel special. Racism is an act of love, a perverted act of love, but the people who made me racist were the people who loved me the most and used black folks as those other people to make me feel special. And like Miss Helen had hired this man to rake her yard. So I went over to him, and I was curious about him as an elderly man, probably younger than I am now, but he looked old to me. And he was bent over and he was wearing this flannel shirt. And it wasn't his color that attracted me, that made me curious, because everybody was either black or white, and that was no big deal, different colors of people. I didn't know what that didn't have a meaning to me, except it was beautiful. And I asked this man, I said, why are you wearing this such a hot shirt on a day like today? It's like 100 degrees out here. He says, well, honey, he says, when I sweat, the flannel soaks up the wet, and then when the wind blows, it's like air conditioning. I thought, wow, this is the wisdom of the ages. And so we started talking. And then Miss Helen comes down, and I call her Miss Helen because that's the way you did in the South. Titling among both blacks and whites is extremely important, carries all kind of significance. And nobody teaches you this, you just absorb it. That people your parents' age, you call them Mr. in their last name, Mr. Johnson, Mrs. McGo. People who go to your grandparents' age, they up the level of respect. They're called Mr. in their first name, Mr. Joe, Mr. Bill, Mr. Harry. And the wife, the older lady, never has to be Mrs. again as long as she is now Miss. I mean, she's been married 9 times. She is now Miss Pearl or Miss Helen, but that's esteemed. So I learned this somehow because Miss Helen had taken me under her wing. She wanted to teach me how to be a Southern gentleman, and I loved that, teaching me how to not to talk with my mouth full or to keep my elbows off the table or to say yes or yes, ma'am, because it meant she thought I was special or had potential for special. So she comes down and says, what are y'all doing? Talking to me and her yard boy. And she said, oh, I'm talking to my friend because I wanted to impress her, Mr. Joe. And she says, oh, no, honey, Joe's not a Mr. Joe's a, and then she used the N-word. And at that moment, I wished that she had kicked Joe. I wish she had spat on him. I wish she had called him a dirty no, but she didn't. She did what was worse. She smiled at him. And then she said, isn't that right, Joe? And Joe said, yes, Miss Helen, that's right. And then he said, one day Joe will call you Mister, but you'll never have to call Joe Mister. Isn't that right, Joe? Joe said, yes, Miss Helen, that's right. And then she said, Joe, can I get so hot out here? Can I go inside and fix you some lemonade? You're doing such a good job. That's how the racism got in. It goes through the back door, because I'm looking around. Miss Helen is still this sweet Christian person who obviously loves Joe, and I have no doubt that she did love Joe. And here Joe is. I didn't know that I was looking on an external face, the only face that was safe for him to show me at the time. That inside didn't know what was going on inside of him, and it didn't matter. That was the point. It didn't matter. He was okay with it. What was okay was it was all about race. I finally understood my surroundings. It was another BGO, blinding glimmer of the obvious, which is how most transformational moments come. It's not from God coming down and with the lightning strike or new information that you read in a book. It's seeing the things that have been around you all your life for the first time or in a different way. So it was all of a sudden I understood about why there are white water fountains and why the dirty ones the blacks have to drink out of, the ones that are rusted and corroded, and why the schools are so drastically different, and why the neighborhoods, why one neighborhood doesn't have any running water or sewage, or it's like, it's about color. That's when I became the racist. That's when I understood it's about color. And somehow my color is better. And there was no shame in that. There was pride in that. It took me a long time to accept, yes, I loved my white privilege. I still love my white privilege because it's made, you can't find me a 5-year-old, 6-year-old kid who will say, no, Miss Helen, don't make me feel special at Joe's expense. It's like, no, I want to feel special. I'm built to feel special. I'll take whatever it is. And so that toxicity goes in with the love at the same time, with the specialness, and it gets all mixed in with the roots. So I wanted to write a novel that talked about that. How do you take, in a neighborhood, how do you create racist? Like I said, it was necessary in the South, and it's necessary anywhere where you, for example, I was talking about Northerners don't understand segregation in the South, is that you think about it, it's about separating people. Yes, that's true institutionally, but most of the towns in Mississippi only had 5,000, 10,000, 25,000 people. And in each town, half are black and half are white. There's no way you can physically separate us. We're in each other's lives and on an intimate basis every day. Black women are in white homes. We shop with each other in the stores. We share the lines. We walk on the same sidewalks. Black men are working in the yards. We are like this. We're highly visible to each other. So to make something like Jim Crow, which is institutionalized marginalization by making the other person the other, you have to do something that physical segregation won't do. We can rely on physical segregation in the North, but in the South, we'd have psychological segregation. Children had to be taught not to see black folks as people. From that moment on, I never saw Mr. Joe as a person. He was Miss Helen's yard boy, and that's all I needed to do. He was a functionary, like the maids, like the field workers, and I still fight with that today. When I see an African American, it's so hard for me not to put them into the group of people, rather than to see a father or a mother or a child or an uncle or a preacher, and so that's what Miss Hazel was about. I have no idea how I'm doing on time. We have till 6 o'clock tonight, right? Okay, questions. Let's do questions.
I understand that Laurel, Mississippi was founded by successful Northerners.
Oh,
Did they have any impact on the culture?
Extreme impact. Laurel, Mississippi is a town of about 25,000 people. The gardeners from Iowa came down, and they were lumber people. And they cut down all the trees that they knew of in their forest in the north, so they came down to Mississippi for the yellow pine. And Laurel is in Jones County, which is called the Free State of Jones. Yes. There's a movie coming out later on this year with Matthew McConaughey called the Free State of Jones, which is about our county. Not made up of Southern planters, but made up of very, very poor Irish pig farmers and subsistence. And so these gardeners came down and bought the entire county, all the land. But they didn't. There's a saying in Mississippi, it's like these were not your typical lumber barons, which would come in and cut everything down and then leave. Destruction. They came down and brought their families and decided they were going to build an ideal community based on principles of, it was a time of the City Beautiful movement, where a lot of the cities were saying the way that we build our buildings and our places, public places, mold the souls of our inhabitants. So there's a lot of money going into this beautiful architecture. And so they built a town, and they brought in architects from Italy and France to build their homes, these beautiful Georgian homes, and these beautiful, and then they brought down Scott Dunn, I forget his name. He was the greatest golf designer in the world at the time, brought him from Scotland to design the golf course in Laurel, Mississippi. They wanted a public park system, so they brought down the firm that built Central Park in New York City. They wanted a good educational system, so they went to the University of Chicago, which was the educational mecca of the, and hired professors to come down. And they put money where their mouth was. You still go to Laurel, and these beautiful, beautiful homes are there, gorgeous homes. So we had a benevolent a dictatorship in a way. These people had the money, they ran the town, they brought in culture. A life-changing thing was one of their children died when he was 21 years old, so they devoted the house they were building to him, this beautiful Georgian mansion, to nothing but art. And they brought in world-class art collections. So when I was a kid, I was able to see Rembrandt, and it changed here's this really poor dirt kid, not knowing, and going to this mansion with all the art. It just changed my life forever in the fourth grade. Every fourth grade class would go there. Then their money ran out because the pine ran out. But at the same time, there was a man named R.H. Mason who lived in Laurel. He said, since all we got left is pine dust now, wonder what I can do with that. So he created Masonite and became a union town, and the only union town in the state. And what was different was because the Gardners weren't racially, weren't as racist as the local culture were, they actually made sure that they hired blacks, equal opportunity with whites. This was like in the late 1800s, early 1900s. They even hired blacks as foremen to be over whites, which was not done. They went against, in fact, it's no accident that during the peak of the civil rights movement, that the families were still there living in their homes. But a granddaughter of one of the lumber barons and her mansion had a family maid, and her family maid would oftentimes bring her niece to help clean. And the woman had two great baby grand pianos in her living room. And the little girl loved to sing gospels and play the piano in her church choir. And so whenever the white woman wasn't around, she would play, and then one day Miss Chisholm walked in and said, "What are you doing at the piano?" She said, "I'm sorry." I'm saying, No, keep playing. And she loved it so much, she got her into Juilliard and Wilberforce College. And then, of course, she became Leontine Price at the Metropolitan Opera. Because that was one part of Laurel, Mississippi, this old established northern libertarian, very liberal, and then the other part, because Laurel, Mississippi is also in backwoods, and it's some of the most worst racial atrocities happened right there as well. In fact, I grew up around the Knights. If you go to the movie, you'll see this. There's a man named Newt Knight who ran away from the Civil War because he was tired of what they called it was a rich man's war and a poor man's fight. It was for slavery, and most of the people in Jones County didn't have slaves. They were too poor. So he just left. And when he left, he took some other people with him, and they took over the county. And the county Mississippi seceded from the Union. Jones County seceded from Mississippi. And just said, stay away, no uniforms. And they had a little guerrilla force that ran the county. Now, Newt Knight had a wife that he really loved and had children by, but his father had a slave that he really loved, Rachel, who he set up housekeeping with, one house next to the next, the White House and the Black House, and he had children, all of them Knights. And then he wasn't a liberal because he believed white was still better, so he tried to interbreed his children so that they would come out all white. So that's the county that I was born into. And when anybody says their last name is Knight, you look really careful because there are black knights and there are dark knights and there are white knights and there are mulatto knights, and there's like all different phases, and nobody ever says they're kin to each other because of this shared crazy history. So we had this real racial primitive DNA as well, so that in 1960s, when the power of the gardeners and the older families started to diminish, and we became a more industrial town where blacks and whites were competing for the dollar, that's when the Klan arose. And also in that same town, May the 9th, 1951, I was born. That's not a reason why that date is important, though, but my mother was giving birth to me in Laurel, Mississippi at the Masonite Hospital. Everything was named Masonite. The Masonite Hospital. And 4 blocks away at the courthouse, there was a man being lynched, a man named Willie McGee. and he had been accused of raping a white woman. Everybody knew that it was a consensual affair, but once it comes to life, in those days, you had to kill the black man to protect the purity of white womanhood. And there were 1,000 people on the courthouse lawn at midnight when the electric chair went off. And I saw pictures when I didn't know about this until I was 45 years old. I didn't know about any of this stuff until I was 45 because I lived in my white bubble that Miss Helen taught me these things are important. But then when I started getting interested, 4 blocks away, I said, Mama, what was that like? She never heard of Willie McGee, never heard of a lynching that ever happened in Laurel, Mississippi, or Jones County. And we lynched more black people in Jones County than any other, but they never saw it. They never heard of it. Nobody they knew. That's not like us. That's not who we are. And I looked at Time magazine, and there Willie McGee's picture was on Time magazine. He was also there were riots in Paris, France. Jean-Paul Sartre got involved. Einstein got involved. They were huge but our little town, we just didn't, we had the luxury of not seeing it. So at that time, one of the men watching that execution, standing in there, was a young businessman. His name was Sam Bowers. He had an amusement company called Sambo's Amusement Company. Sold pinball machines or rented them out, leased them. And he was a businessman, really respected, grew up to be on the JCs. He was our Sunday school teacher. And he was only 10 years away from being the imperial wizard of the KKK. And if you saw Mississippi Burning, that was him. He was the one that orchestrated the death of the 3 civil rights workers, the 2 white kids from up north and the black kid from Mississippi, Goodman, Swerner, and Cheney. And so that was the little town. So it became, and it still is, it's still a little racist Jim Crow town. The racism is now fueled through religious intolerance. That's the new racism of Mississippi, is religious intolerance. Anyway.
Thanks for coming today, and I'm going to be out getting a book. See you next year.
I'm going to get to you next. Yeah, I know.